The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Pearl Ellsworth would later say was the cruelest irony of all, because Tuesday was the day her father had always called the day of false beginnings. She was standing on the porch of the Ellsworth homestead when Hector Graves rode up with the mail pouch, and she already knew from the set of his shoulders that something was wrong. She had been waiting for 2 weeks for word from the bank in Amarillo, Texas, and the envelope Hector held out to her was thin and official-looking, and stamped with the kind of red ink that banks used when they wanted to remind you that they owned everything you thought was yours. She read it twice on the porch and then a third time sitting on the step with her knees pulled to her chest, and the words did not change no matter how many times she moved her eyes across them. Foreclosure, 60 days, outstanding balance of $412, and then the other letters came, one by one, over the course of that same week, not from banks but from ranchers. The first was from Dale Prout of the Crooked P Ranch, who was 61 years old and already had 2 grown sons, and who wrote in a hand so cramped it looked like a fence wire had dragged itself across the paper. He offered to buy the Ellsworth spread for $200 cash, a figure so low it was not an offer so much as an insult with a signature on it. The second was from Calhoun Monroe, who ran the largest cattle operation in Haskell County, and who had the kind of smile Pearl had always distrusted, the kind that appeared before the rest of the face had decided it meant it. Calhoun offered $300 and the use of a lined shack on his eastern border, as though he were doing her a kindness by suggesting she move from her own home into a one-room structure designed for men passing through. The third offer came from Roy Beaumont, who was 47 and widowed, and whose letter was the most offensive of all because it was not entirely about the land. Roy suggested that a formal arrangement between himself and Pearl might be mutually beneficial, that he needed a wife and she needed capital, and that surely she could see the practical wisdom in combining both problems into a single solution. She burned Roy's letter in the cast iron stove and did not write back to any of them. By the 4th week after the bank notice, Pearl had received 7 offers from 7 different ranchers across the territory, each one more calculated than the last, each one framed as generosity when it was really nothing more than opportunity wearing a gentler coat. These men had watched her father work that land for 22 years. They had watched Pearl herself take over the operation after his death 18 months ago, managing a herd of 63 head of Texas Longhorn cattle, maintaining the fencing, negotiating with the buyers who came through Abilene and Sweetwater, doing everything a woman was not supposed to be able to do in the year of our Lord 1878 in the Texas Panhandle. And now that trouble had found her, now that the drought had thinned her herd and the bank had tired of waiting, every single one of them had their pens out and their prices ready. Every single one except Wesley Atkins. Wesley had the 40-acre spread that bordered Pearl's eastern fence line. He ran a modest operation, 50 head of cattle, a few horses, a vegetable garden his mother had planted before she passed, and that he maintained with a stubbornness Pearl had always found quietly admirable. He was 32 years old with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were permanently stained with honest work, and eyes the exact gray-brown color of sage after a rainstorm. He had been her nearest neighbor for 6 years, and in 6 years they had spoken perhaps 24 times, the polite exchanges of people who shared a fence line and a water source and nothing else. She had always been aware of him the way you are aware of a solid thing in your peripheral vision, something dependable and unhurried, and not requiring your immediate attention. The morning after she received Roy Beaumont's letter and burned it in the stove, she woke before dawn to find that 12 of her cattle had broken through the north fence and were scattered across the dry creek bed on the property line between her land and Wesley's. She pulled on her boots and her coat, caught her horse from the paddock, and rode out into the gray half-light to begin the slow, exhausting work of moving 12 frightened longhorns back through a gap in the fence that would need wire and posts and time she did not have. She had been at it for 40 minutes, managing 4 of the 12 with a patience that was beginning to fray at the edges, when she heard hoofbeats coming from the east. Wesley Atkins came out of the morning fog on his roan gelding like something from a dream she had not known she was having. He was wearing his work coat, and his hat was pulled low, and he did not say good morning or ask her what had happened or offer any commentary on her situation at all. He simply rode around to the far side of the scattered herd and began moving cattle the way only someone who had been doing it since childhood can do it, with a quiet efficiency that seemed to command the animals without frightening them. They worked together for an hour without speaking more than 10 words. They moved all 12 head back through the gap in the fence, and then Wesley tied his horse to the nearest post and went to his saddlebag and came back with wire stretchers and staples, and a section of fencing wire rolled and tucked under his arm, materials he had apparently brought without being asked. Pearl watched him for a moment before she found her voice. She said she supposed she should thank him for bringing supplies. He said he saw the cattle from his morning ride and figured she would need the wire. He said his fence line ran to about 60 yards east of the gap, and he had noticed the post was rotting at the base for 2 weeks, and he should have said something sooner. She stared at him. He was already measuring the wire. She said he did not have to apologize for her fence post. He said he was not apologizing. He was explaining. There was a difference, and Pearl Ellsworth felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she was not entirely prepared for, because in the preceding weeks she had learned a great deal about the difference between men who explained and men who apologized in order to receive gratitude, and Wesley Atkins was the first one who had not seemed to want anything from the exchange at all. They fixed the fence together, and she rode back to her house and stood in her kitchen and looked at the cold stove and the bank letter that was still sitting on the table, because she had not yet decided what to do with it. And she thought about what it meant that 7 men had put a price on her desperation, and 1 man had simply ridden out at dawn with a roll of wire. Now let the story move back even further to where the trouble had truly begun, so that the weight of what came after might be fully understood. Pearl Ellsworth was 28 years old. She had grown up on the Ellsworth homestead, the only child of Franklin and Margaret Ellsworth, who had come west from Tennessee in 1855, when Franklin was young and full of the particular recklessness that the frontier promised to cure or to kill. He had filed his claim on a section of land in Haskell County, Texas, built his house with 2 rooms, and then added 3 more over the years as circumstances improved. And by the time Pearl was old enough to understand what her family had, she understood that it was not wealth by any definition the East Coast would recognize, but it was theirs, and that mattered more than money in a country where belonging was still something you had to prove by staying. Margaret died of a fever when Pearl was 14. Franklin never remarried, and Pearl became something between a daughter and a partner on the ranch, learning the cattle work alongside the cooking and the mending, and all the other work that the territory assumed belonged to women by nature and to men by choice. She had strong opinions about that assumption, which she generally kept to herself, because expressing them too loudly in Haskell County in the 1870s was a reliable way to ensure that no one would listen to you when you needed them to. Franklin died in the autumn of 1876, not dramatically, not violently, but of the slow accumulation of hard work and dry years, and a heart that had been quietly failing for months before it gave out entirely one October morning in the south pasture. Pearl found him at noon, his hat still on his head, sitting against a cedar post as though he had simply decided to rest. She buried him on the hill behind the house next to her mother, and she did not sell the ranch, which was what everyone expected her to do. She hired 2 hands, a 17-year-old named Tamaz whose family had worked the area before the American settlers arrived, and who knew the land in a way that no deed of title could fully describe, and an older man named Henry who had been ranching in Texas for 30 years, and who would not look directly at Pearl when she told him what she expected in the way of work and wages, but who, to his credit, did the work, and accepted the wages without further complaint. The drought came in the summer of 1878. It was not the worst drought the territory had seen, but it came at the wrong time, when Pearl's herd had been reduced by an illness that had taken 11 head the previous winter, and when the bank note on the property was due for renewal, and the loan officer in Amarillo had been replaced by a younger man named Silas Holt, who had not known Franklin Ellsworth, and did not feel the particular social obligation that small-town credit often ran on. By July, Pearl's remaining cattle were thinner than they should have been. The creek on the southern border had slowed to a trickle, and Tamaz had gone home to his family because Pearl could no longer pay him with any reliability. Henry stayed because Henry had nowhere else to go, and also because he was, at the core of him, a decent man who would not leave a woman to manage 60 head of cattle alone on a failing ranch. By September, the bank letter arrived, and the offers started coming, and Pearl spent 3 weeks feeling the particular kind of fury that comes when you realize that the people around you have been waiting for you to fail. Wesley Atkins had homesteaded his 40 acres in 1872, arriving from Missouri after the war had taken enough from him that he no longer wanted to be anywhere that held its memory. He was a private man in the way that men who have seen violent things often become private, not cold exactly, but careful, as though he had learned that the world could take things quickly and without warning, and that the best defense was to need very little and to offer what you had quietly and without spectacle. He had no family in the territory. He had a horse named Brute who was neither brutal nor particularly gentle but was reliable, which Wesley valued above all other qualities. He had his cattle and his garden, and a copy of the complete works of Charles Dickens that he had carried from Missouri in his saddlebag, which said something about him that no one in Haskell County had thought to ask about. He had noticed Pearl Ellsworth in the way that quiet men notice things, steadily and without comment. He had seen her ride out in all weather to check her herd. He had seen her argue with a cattle buyer through a fence line and come away with a better price, which impressed him considerably. He had seen her in town at the general store run by Harold Finch, buying supplies with the careful calculation of someone who knew exactly how much she had and what she needed, and was doing complicated arithmetic in her head while she stood at the counter. He had not offered to buy her land when the news of her financial difficulty reached him through the particular efficient telegraph of small community gossip. He had not offered anything. He had simply paid attention. The morning he rode out to help her with the broken fence was not the beginning of a plan or the execution of some hidden strategy. It was the simple act of a man who saw a problem that he could help solve and who saw no reason to turn away from it, which was, in a territory full of men with hidden motives, a kind of radical honesty that Pearl Ellsworth did not know what to do with at first. After the fence, he came back 3 days later. She was in the east pasture replacing a section of rotted post when his roan appeared over the ridge. He rode up and dismounted and tied his horse, and without preamble picked up the second post hole digger that was leaning against the supply wagon and began digging. She said she had not asked for his help. He said he knew. She said she also did not need it. He looked at the single post she had managed to set in the 2 hours she had been working, and then he looked at the 12 remaining gaps in the fence line where posts needed replacing, and he did not say anything, which was an extremely effective way of making his point. She told him he was aggravating. He said he had been told that before. They worked in a silence that was different from the silence of strangers. It had texture to it, that silence, the comfortable friction of two people who are beginning to notice each other's rhythms without having formally agreed to do so. He dug holes with a deliberate efficiency, and she set posts with a precision he recognized as the result of long practice. And by the time the sun was directly overhead, they had replaced 7 posts, and the fence line looked as solid as it had in years. He stayed for the noon meal, not because she invited him exactly, but because she said she had made a pot of bean soup, and it was too much for one person, and he accepted this without making it into anything larger than what it was, which was soup. They sat at her kitchen table with the bank letter still visible on the far corner, turned face down now, and ate soup and bread, and he asked her about the shorthorn bull she had acquired the previous spring, which was a business question, but also a sign that he had been paying closer attention to her operation than she had realized. She told him about the bull, which she had purchased on credit from a breeder in Abilene, with the intention of improving the quality of her spring calves, and therefore the price she could command from buyers. It was a sound plan disrupted by the drought and the bank's impatience, and when she explained it, he listened with the seriousness of someone evaluating a military campaign, not looking for holes in her reasoning but genuinely following the logic. He said the plan was a good one. She said it did not matter how good the plan was if the bank called the note before the calves were old enough to sell. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much time do you need?" She told him she needed 60 days and approximately $412, and either of those things was unlikely to materialize. He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his hat and thanked her for the soup and left, and she sat at her table and looked at the face-down letter and tried to understand what she was feeling, which was a complicated mixture of gratitude and frustration, and something else that she did not want to examine too closely, because it had no practical application to her current situation. He came back the next morning. He came back the morning after that. He came back the morning after that one too, and each morning he brought something, sometimes tools, sometimes his own labor, once a 50-pound sack of cornmeal that he set on her porch without comment, and which she knew represented a significant portion of his own winter supplies. He helped her repair the barn roof where 2 sections had warped in the heat. He helped her move her remaining herd to the north pasture, where there was still some grass, a decision that required running a temporary fence line across a 1/4 mile of open ground, and took the better part of 2 days. He looked at her water situation and spent a long afternoon working with Henry to deepen the secondary well at the north end of the property, which had been producing only marginally but which yielded better water at a lower depth. He never made an offer on the land. He never offered money, which she could not have accepted. He never offered marriage as a solution to her financial problems, which was what Roy Beaumont had done, and which she had found both insulting and revealing. He offered only his time and his work and his steady, unremarkable presence and Pearl Ellsworth, who had been dealing with men who wanted something from her since the moment her father died, and left her legally unprotected by the social conventions that attached a woman's credibility to a man's name, found this so disorienting that she occasionally had to stop what she was doing and simply stand still for a moment to let the unfamiliarity of it settle. Henry noticed. Henry was 63 years old and had been married once to a woman he still spoke of, with a reverence that suggested the marriage had been the defining event of his life, and he had the particular perceptiveness of a man who had been paying attention to human nature for a long time. Henry said to Pearl one evening while they were finishing up in the barn, he said that Wesley Atkins came around a lot. Pearl said he was a neighbor and he was helpful. Henry said that most neighbors were helpful when they wanted something in return. Pearl said she knew that. Henry said he did not think Wesley Atkins wanted anything in return. Pearl did not answer. She put up the brushes and closed the barn door and went to the house, and she stood at her kitchen window in the dark and looked out at the flat, dark Texas panhandle spreading away in every direction, and she thought about what it would mean if Henry was right. Because if Wesley Atkins did not want anything in return, then whatever was happening between them was not a transaction. And Pearl had spent the past 18 months thinking about every human interaction in terms of transactions, because that was how survival worked in a territory where the banks and the buyers and the neighboring ranchers, and even the church ladies who brought casseroles to bereaved families, were all operating on the currency of mutual obligation. And the idea that someone might simply show up and help without calculation was, in its way, more frightening than the alternatives. Because if he was not calculating, then he might be something else entirely, and she was not sure she was ready to want what that something else might be. 3 weeks after he started coming around, something happened that shifted the entire shape of the situation. Calhoun Monroe rode onto Pearl's property on a Thursday morning without invitation, which was either brave or stupid depending on how you looked at it, and he rode with 2 of his hands flanking him in a way that was clearly designed to suggest his importance, which Pearl found tiresome. He said he had come to make a final offer, that the bank in Amarillo was a friend of his, and he had heard that the foreclosure was progressing, and he wanted to give Pearl one last chance to accept his price before she lost everything. Pearl said she would give his offer the same consideration she had given his first one. Calhoun said she did not understand her position. He said a woman alone on a ranch in Haskell County, without family, was not in a position to be selective. Pearl said she understood her position better than he did. He said the price was $350, which he framed as generosity, and he looked around her yard in a way that suggested he was already mentally placing his cattle in her pastures. She was about to tell him what she thought of his $350 when Wesley Atkins rode through her gate. Wesley came at a walk, which was the correct pace for a man who wanted to communicate that he was not in a hurry and was not intimidated, and he rode up beside Pearl's porch, and he looked at Calhoun Monroe with the particular steady regard of a man who had served 4 years in a war and had learned to look at large situations without blinking. He said good morning. Calhoun said this was a private business matter. Wesley said he supposed it was, and he dismounted and tied Brute to the porch rail and came up the steps and leaned against the post with his arms crossed, and his physical presence next to Pearl's was the kind of statement that did not require words. Calhoun looked from one to the other, and his expression shifted through several phases: the calculation, the reassessment, the frustration of a man whose leverage has suddenly become less reliable. He said the offer stood until the end of the month. He rode out with his men behind him, and Pearl watched him go with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and then she turned to Wesley and said she did not need anyone to stand beside her as though she required protection. He said he knew she did not need it. He said he wanted to be there, and those were 2 different things. She looked at him for a long moment. The Texas morning was already hot, the light hard and flat and unforgiving, and in that light Wesley Atkins looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been through difficult things and come out the other side with his character intact, which was not as common as it should have been. She said all right. He said all right. They went inside and she made coffee and they sat at her table, and for the first time since the bank letter arrived, Pearl allowed herself to say out loud all of it: the debt, the timeline, the herd numbers, the calculations she had been running in her head for weeks. She laid it out plainly, the way she might have laid it out for a business partner, because that was the only way she knew how to speak about something this important without emotion overtaking the facts. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said he had $400 saved in the Sweetwater Bank. He said he had been saving it for 3 years for the purpose of expanding his own herd, and he said he wanted to lend it to her to settle the bank note, interest-free, with the understanding that she would repay it from the proceeds of the spring calf sales, which by his estimate at current prices would more than cover it. She stared at him. He said it was a loan and nothing more, and he would put it in writing if she needed it that way, and she did not have to decide immediately, but he wanted her to know the option existed. Pearl felt something break open in her chest that was neither grief nor joy, but something that sat between them, the dissolution of a wall she had built carefully over the past 18 months, and she had to look away from him and out the window at the flat, hard country and breathe for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. She said she could not take $400 from him. He said she could take $400 as a loan with terms she agreed to, and that was a different thing from taking. She said he had worked for 3 years to save that money. He said he knew. He said he was choosing to do something with it that seemed more important to him than the thing he had originally planned. She said, what if the calves did not sell at the price they were hoping for? He said he supposed they would negotiate an extended repayment. He said he was not going anywhere. The words settled into the room with a weight that they both felt, because not going anywhere was the thing that Pearl Ellsworth had been without since October of 1876, when she found her father against the cedar post with his hat still on. And it was the thing that every one of the 7 ranchers with their 7 offers had inadvertently made clear they were not willing to be. Only interested in the property and not in the person. Only interested in the land and not in the life being built on it. She said she would think about it. He said that was fair. He left without pressing her, which was another thing that distinguished him from every other man who had sat at her table in the past 2 months. She thought about it for 3 days. She talked to Henry, who said the same thing he had said before, that Wesley Atkins did not seem to want anything in return, and Henry said it with the careful tone of a man who hoped she understood what that actually meant. She talked to no one else because there was no one else to talk to. The church ladies would counsel her to accept one of the marriage offers. The banker in Amarillo had no interest in her welfare. Tomás, if she could reach him, would probably tell her to trust what her gut was saying, because Tomás had a philosophical pragmatism about life that Pearl had always respected. What her gut was saying was that Wesley Atkins was the first man in 18 months who had looked at her and seen a person rather than an opportunity, and that terrified her more than the foreclosure. She rode to his place on a Saturday morning with her answer. His homestead was modest and clean, the kind of place kept by a man who took care of things as a matter of character rather than a matter of impression. The garden his mother had planted was still producing, late-season squash and dried bean pods, and the remains of a kitchen garden that spoke of careful attention. The house itself was 1 story with a covered porch and smoke coming from the chimney, despite the remaining warmth of September, which meant he was up and cooking. She knocked and he came to the door in his shirt sleeves and looked at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, giving her room. She said she would accept the loan on his terms, and she needed it in writing. She said she would repay him from the spring calf sales, and if those were insufficient she would make arrangements for the remainder by the following autumn at the latest. He said those terms were acceptable. She said she also wanted it understood that she was not in the habit of accepting charity and this was not charity. He said he knew. He said it was a business arrangement between neighbors. She said all right. He said all right. He made coffee and they sat at his kitchen table, and he got out paper, and they wrote the terms of the loan in plain language, and both of them signed it, and he gave her his copy and kept hers. And it was the most straightforward document she had signed in 18 months. And it made her want to cry, which she did not do because she was Pearl Ellsworth and she did not cry in front of people. But she felt the pressure of it behind her eyes the whole ride back. The following Tuesday she rode to Sweetwater with Henry and they deposited Wesley's $400 in her account and wrote a bank draft to the First National Bank of Amarillo and sent it by mail with a letter of her own composition that was notably shorter on gratitude than Silas Holt probably expected. The foreclosure was halted. She rode home and told Henry, and Henry said quietly that some things work out right. Wesley came the next morning as usual, and she told him the draft had been sent, and he nodded and said good, and went out to look at the section of barn wall that had been worrying him for a week, and they did not make anything more of it than that. And yet everything was different and they both knew it. The shift in what existed between them was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single conversation or a single moment of revelation. It happened the way seasons change in the Texas panhandle, not gradually exactly, but in a series of almost imperceptible movements that you only recognize in retrospect as having been constant and inevitable. She started to watch him when he worked. Not obviously, not in a way that she would have been able to explain if asked, but with the particular attentiveness of a woman who is beginning to understand that someone is important to her. She watched the way he moved, economical and sure, no wasted motion, no performance, just the clean execution of necessary work. She watched the way he handled her cattle, patient and firm, respecting the animal's nature instead of fighting it. She watched the way he spoke to Henry as an equal man to man, which Henry appreciated and which Pearl noticed. She started thinking about him when he was not there, which was new. She would be doing something in the evening, the mending or the accounts or the reading she tried to keep up, because her father had always said that reading was the thing that kept the mind from going small. And she would find herself thinking about something Wesley had said that morning or the expression on his face when she had told a dry joke about the price of cornmeal and he had laughed, a real laugh. Not the social laugh of a man trying to please a woman, but the genuine, involuntary laugh of someone who has been genuinely caught off guard by amusement. He had a good laugh. She found herself wanting to hear it again. He was changing too, though his changes were even quieter than hers. He started arriving a little earlier each morning, which she noticed but did not comment on. He started bringing small things, not the significant gifts like the cornmeal, but small useful things, a packet of good coffee, a new leather strop for the blade she kept in the barn, once a book, Bleak House, which he left on her porch without a note. But it was from his collection and she knew it, and she read it in the evenings by lamplight, and thought about the fact that he had chosen that particular one for her, which meant he had thought about what she might like. She left a loaf of bread on his porch one morning. It was the first thing she had given him, and she did not make anything of it, and neither did he. But the next day he said it was the best bread he had eaten since his mother's, and from the way he said it, she understood that this was not flattery but a true thing, and she felt the warmth of that truth in her chest like a coal that has been blown on and begun to glow. October came and the heat broke and the panhandle turned that particular autumn gold that Pearl had always loved, the dry grass catching the lower light and holding it, the sky going that impossible deep blue that only appeared after the summer's haze finally lifted. The cattle looked better than they had in months on the north pasture's recovered grass, and Pearl's mood lifted with them. She and Wesley had fallen into a routine that neither of them had formally established. He came every morning. They worked through whatever needed doing. They ate the noon meal together, usually at her house because she had a better kitchen and because they were both more comfortable in that space, which had become, gradually and without announcement, a space that held both of them. Henry ate with them on most days, and Henry was decent enough to keep his observations about this arrangement to himself, though Pearl caught him smiling at the table more than strictly necessary. In the evenings Wesley went back to his own place, which was the proper way of things, and Pearl told herself that she was relieved by this, which was not entirely true. The night that changed everything came in mid-October. There was a storm. Not the spectacular kind with lightning and hail that sometimes came through in summer, but a serious working storm, with sustained high winds and driving rain that came out of the northwest in the early hours of the morning, and went directly for the north fence line that Pearl and Wesley had repaired in September. The wind took out 3 posts in the night and moved 8 of Pearl's cattle through the gap before she heard the commotion and got her boots on. She went out in the rain with her lantern and her coat and found Henry already at the north pasture trying to manage a situation that was, in the terms of wet dark nights and frightened cattle, not manageable by 2 people. Wesley appeared out of the dark before she had time to calculate whether it was reasonable to hope he would come. He had heard the wind and had, apparently, simply thought of her. He was soaked through already and he had his rope, and he came in next to Pearl and Henry, and they worked in the dark, and the rain for 2 hours with mud up to their boot ankles and the wind tearing at their coats. And Pearl was aware, through all of it, of Wesley's voice in the dark calling out the position of the cattle, his lantern swinging as he moved, his reliability as a fixed point in a chaotic situation. By the time they got the cattle contained, and a temporary rope line up where the fence posts had been. They were all three exhausted and soaked, and it was 3 in the morning. Henry went to his bunk in the barn, and Pearl and Wesley stood on her porch in the relative shelter of the roof overhang with the rain still coming down hard around them. And Pearl looked at Wesley standing there dripping, his coat dark with rain and his hair plastered flat, and his jaw set with the particular expression of a man who is very tired but has not quite wound down yet. And she felt something so clear and so definite that it stopped her breath. She loved him. Not beginning to love him, not leaning toward loving him, but loved him past tense already. Had been loving him probably since the morning she came out of the fog and found him already moving her cattle with a quiet efficiency that asked nothing of her. And she had only now, standing on her porch in the rain at 3 in the morning, admitted it to herself with complete honesty. He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain was loud and the night was dark and they were both wet and tired, and the whole situation was entirely unromantic by any conventional measure. And she said, very quietly, "Thank you for coming." He said, in an equally quiet voice, he said he would always come. They stood looking at each other in the rain for a long moment, and then Pearl Ellsworth, who had not been a woman to yield to impulse in the 18 months since her father died, stepped forward and kissed Wesley Atkins on the mouth. It was a brief kiss, almost tentative, the kiss of a woman testing the reality of something she has been thinking about without letting herself think about it. And Wesley was still for the first second of it, surprised, and then he kissed her back with a warmth and a care that made her eyes sting. And she thought in the middle of it that this was what it was supposed to feel like. Not the transaction, not the negotiation, not the calculation of mutual benefit, but this. The simple, honest want of one person for another. They stepped back from each other. She said she was sorry if that was too forward. He said it was not. She said it was very late and he was soaked through and he should probably stay. She had a spare room, and he could get dry things from the bundle she kept for Henry's occasional overnight stays. He said he appreciated that. He stayed in the spare room and she lay in her own bed listening to the rain on the roof and the distant sound of the cattle settling in the north pasture, and she felt, for the first time in 18 months, not alone. In the morning the storm had passed, and the sky was scrubbed clean, and the panhandle spread in every direction looking fresh and wide and possible. Wesley made coffee because he was up first, which she found both presumptuous and deeply pleasant, and they sat across her kitchen table in the early light, and there was the question between them that had been established by the kiss and that required some kind of address. She said she supposed they should talk about last night. He said he supposed so. She said she was not a woman who kissed people impulsively and then wanted to pretend it had not happened. He said he was glad to hear that. She said she also was not a woman who had a great deal of time for the kind of conversation in which people talked around what they actually meant. So she was going to say plainly that she had feelings for him that had been developing for some time, and she wanted to know if that was a shared situation. He looked at her across the table with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he said that it was very much a shared situation, and that he had been aware of his feelings for considerably longer than he had been comfortable with. She said how long. He said, honestly, probably since the morning he rode through her gate 6 years ago and saw her arguing with a cattle buyer through the fence and winning. She stared at him. 6 years. 6 years of quiet attention and careful respect, and not a single word of it until she had kissed him in the rain because she could not help herself. She said he might have mentioned it at some point in the preceding 6 years. He said she had been working very hard, and he had not wanted to be another thing she had to manage. Something in her chest did something complicated and tender at that, because it was the most considerate and also the most maddening thing she had ever heard from a man, and she told him so. He smiled at that, and she saw again what she had been seeing in glimpses for weeks, the warmth under the reserve, the humor under the quietness, all the things that a man keeps folded away when he has learned that the world is not always careful with what you show it. She said all right. She said they would see where this went, openly and honestly, no hidden motives, no secrets on her side, and she expected none on his. He said those were terms he could agree to, and he put out his hand and she shook it, and then they both laughed at the formal absurdity of it, and his laugh filled the kitchen and she held onto the sound of it. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Pearl Ellsworth could remember in years, not because her problems had disappeared. The cattle still needed daily management. The fence still needed ongoing repair. The barn roof that Wesley had helped fix in August was showing another vulnerable section in November. The loan repayment was still in front of her, the timeline still pressing. But she was not alone with any of it, and that changed the texture of every day in ways she had not anticipated. Not the big obvious changes, but the small ones. Having someone to talk through the cattle management decisions with, someone whose opinion she actually valued. Having someone to sit with in the evenings when the work was done, not talking necessarily, just existing in the same space in the comfortable way of two people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. Having someone who made her laugh every day, which she had not done reliably in a long time. Wesley was not a dramatic man. He did not make large gestures or romantic speeches. He brought her coffee the way she liked it, black with a small amount of sugar, which she had only mentioned once, and which he had apparently filed away with the same attention he gave to everything. He noticed when she was tired before she admitted it, and suggested stopping work earlier on those days without making her feel managed. He asked her questions about her own thinking and listened to the answers, which sounds simple but was, in Pearl's experience, genuinely rare. They rode together in the evenings when the days allowed it, out across her pastures in the long autumn light, talking about everything and nothing, about Missouri and Tennessee, and what had brought their families west, about books, because it turned out that Pearl read as seriously as Wesley did, and they disagreed productively about Dickens, about the territory and its future, about the cattle industry and where it was going, about small things and large ones. And every conversation felt like another layer of understanding, added to a structure that was becoming solid and real. He kissed her again on a clear November evening at the gate between their properties, the gate that had always functioned as the polite boundary between his land and hers, and this time it was his initiative and it was not tentative. It was a kiss with intention in it, and Pearl put her hand against his jaw and felt him lean into it and thought, clearly and without ambiguity, yes. Calhoun Monroe made one more approach in November, not to Pearl but to Wesley, which Pearl only discovered when Wesley told her about it that same evening over supper. Calhoun had ridden to Wesley's place and offered Wesley money to stop coming around Pearl's ranch, framing it as a business proposition, suggesting that Wesley might want to sell his own land and that Calhoun could make it worth his while. The implication beneath all of it was that Calhoun still wanted the Ellsworth property, and that Wesley was the obstacle to whatever leverage Calhoun was planning to apply. Pearl listened to this with a careful stillness that Wesley recognized as the stillness of someone who is deciding what to do with significant anger. She said, "What had Wesley told him?" Wesley said he had told Calhoun Monroe that his offer was not interesting and that he should not come back. She said, had Calhoun gone? Wesley said he had, but with the kind of departure that left an unpleasant feeling in the air, the type of exit that belonged to men who had not given up on a thing but had simply decided to take a different approach. Pearl said she would ride to Monroe's place in the morning. Wesley said he thought they might go together. She looked at him and considered this, and then she nodded, because going together was not the same as needing protection, and she understood the difference now. They rode to Monroe's ranch the next morning, and Pearl spoke to Calhoun in his own yard, while his hands watched from the barn, and Calhoun's face went through several colors. She told him with a very precise economy of language that the Ellsworth ranch was not for sale now or ever, that the bank situation was resolved, that his interference in her personal affairs was unwelcome and would not be tolerated, and that if he sent anyone onto her property uninvited again, she would have a conversation with the county sheriff in Sweetwater that Calhoun would find considerably less comfortable than this one. Calhoun Monroe looked at Pearl and then at Wesley, who was standing a half step behind her and to the right, not in front of her, not between her and the problem, but present in a way that communicated very clearly that he was there. Calhoun said he understood. They rode home in the clear November morning, and Wesley said she had handled that very well. She said she had been practicing that conversation for 2 months in her head, and it felt good to finally have it. He said it showed. She laughed. The spring calf sales came in April of 1879, and they were better than Pearl had projected. The shorthorn bull she had purchased on credit had done exactly what she had planned, improving the quality of the calves enough that the buyer from a large operation in North Texas paid considerably more per head than the county average. And by the time the sales were finished, Pearl had enough to repay Wesley's $400 in full and to put a small amount back against the following year's operating costs. She rode to his place on a bright April morning with the repayment in a bank envelope, and she sat across from him at his kitchen table and put the envelope down between them. He looked at it. She said $412, the extra $12 being informal interest, which she knew he had said he did not want, but which she was paying anyway because she was Pearl Ellsworth, and she did things properly. He said no interest. She said $12 interest, and she had the better argument. He picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and she watched him do some private calculation, and then he put the envelope back down and slid it across the table toward her. He said he had a different proposal. She looked at the envelope. He said the $400 could stay in place as an investment rather than a loan, a stake in the Ellsworth cattle operation at whatever percentage she thought was fair, and that over time the arrangement might become less complicated if they combined the two operations into one. She understood what he was saying. She understood all of it, the business part and the other part underneath it. She said she wanted to make sure she was understanding him correctly. He said he supposed he should say it more plainly. He said he wanted to marry her if she wanted that, and he was not saying it because of the money or the land or any practical calculation, but because he could not imagine a day that did not have her in it, and he had been unable to imagine one since approximately November, and he thought she ought to know. Pearl sat very still with the envelope between them, and she looked at the man across the table from her, at the gray-brown eyes and the hands that she knew now were capable of great gentleness as well as hard work, at the face that had become as familiar as her own kitchen, and she thought about everything that had happened in the past year and where it had brought them. The bank letter and the 7 offers and the broken fence in the fog and the rain-soaked porch and the evenings riding out in the autumn light and all the mornings and meals and conversations and the slow building of something real between them. She said yes. She said it simply, without qualification, because she was Pearl Ellsworth and she said what she meant. He crossed the room and took her hands in his and said, very quietly, that he would not waste it. She said she knew he would not. They were married in June of 1879 at the small Methodist church in Sweetwater, Texas, which could hold about 40 people, and held approximately 37, because Henry came and the preacher and his wife came and several families from the county came, including, to Pearl's mild surprise, Tamaz and his wife Maria, who rode 40 miles to be there, and brought a gift of dried chili peppers and a handmade quilt that Maria had worked on all winter. Calhoun Monroe did not come, but he sent a brief note acknowledging the marriage with a formality that Pearl suspected had more to do with calculating future relationships with his neighbors than with any actual goodwill, and she accepted it without reading more into it than was there. Dale Prout sent nothing. Roy Beaumont sent nothing. Pearl did not miss their acknowledgement. The ceremony was short, and the celebration afterward in the churchyard was long and warm, and Pearl wore her best dress, which was blue, and her mother's pearl earrings, which she had kept all these years, and Wesley wore a dark coat that was clearly new and that he had clearly acquired specifically for the occasion without mentioning it. And when she saw him at the front of the church, she thought, very clearly, that she was looking at a man she was going to love for the rest of her life. They combined the two properties into one operation in the autumn of 1879, running the two spreads under the Ellsworth name, which Wesley had suggested without Pearl needing to ask, because the name had been on that land for 22 years, and it was Pearl's inheritance and her history, and there was no reason to erase it. He said the work was more important than the name on the deed. She said she thought they could put both names on the deed. He said Ellsworth Atkins or Atkins Ellsworth. She said Ellsworth Atkins alphabetically. He said that was fair. The combined operation ran 120 head into the spring of 1880, and the expanded pasture on Wesley's land solved the grazing problem that the drought years had created on Pearl's original property. And the secondary well that Wesley and Henry had deepened now served the north pastures reliably. And there was a good water situation that neither of them had enjoyed individually, but that together made the whole enterprise more stable. Henry stayed on and managed the day crew with a contentment that suggested the arrangement suited him at least as well as it suited anyone else. And Tamaz came back in the spring of 1880, and Pearl paid him a proper wage and meant it. In the winter of 1880, Pearl knew she was expecting. She told Wesley on a Tuesday morning at their kitchen table, which he immediately said was good because Tuesday was the day of true beginnings in their house, a reference to the day the bank letter had come, and that he had reframed with such deliberate gentleness that she felt tears threaten again, as they had a habit of doing around him at significant moments. He took her hands across the table and said he was very happy. She said she was also very happy and also nervous. He said he was nervous too. She said there were two things that were supposed to scare the other person away, and he had turned both of them into something else. He said he had a gift for that apparently. She threw a biscuit at him, and he caught it and ate it and grinned. And she looked at him grinning in their kitchen, in the house that was now both of theirs. And she felt something so whole and so warm that she had to hold it quietly for a moment before she could speak. Their son was born in September of 1880, a healthy boy with Pearl's dark eyes and Wesley's stubbornness, which manifested very early as a refusal to sleep at the hours that anyone had planned for him. They named him Franklin, for Pearl's father, which was not something Wesley had suggested, and which Pearl had proposed one evening in the summer when she was large with the pregnancy, and they were sitting on the porch in the evening air, and she said she would like to name the baby for her father if it was a boy. Wesley said there was no name he would rather give his son. Franklin Atkins grew up knowing every corner of both the original properties, the expanded Ellsworth Atkins Ranch, as it was known in the county records. He grew up hearing the story of how his mother had nearly lost the ranch, and how his father had helped her save it, not as a grand heroic story, but as a plain true one, told in the matter-of-fact way of two people who did not require drama to know that something had been important. Pearl told it differently than Wesley did. Pearl said his father had come every morning with wire and work and common sense when everyone else had come with wallets and motives. Wesley said Pearl had done all the hard work herself, and he had only helped at the margins. Franklin, growing up between these two versions, decided that the truth was somewhere in the middle, and also that his parents were both entirely impossible, and he loved them very much. A daughter arrived in the spring of 1883, dark-haired and loud from her first breath, who they named Margaret for Pearl's mother, and who turned out to share her grandmother's particular combination of warmth and iron-spined determination, though how Pearl could know this of a woman who had died before Pearl herself was grown was something Wesley teased her about occasionally. Pearl said she could tell. Wesley said she was probably right. Henry passed away in the summer of 1884, quietly, in his bunk in the barn as he had always preferred, and they buried him on the hill behind the house next to Franklin and Margaret Ellsworth, because he had been part of the place, and the place should hold him. Pearl stood at the grave and said that Henry had always known how to see clearly, and she was grateful for every year of it. Tamaz remained and brought his oldest son to work the operation in 1885, and the ranch continued to grow in the measured, solid way that hard work and good management produce, not spectacular but real and lasting. Wesley's desk held his Dickens collection, which now sat beside Pearl's own books on the shelf they had built together against the east wall of the sitting room, and they read in the evenings by lamplight still, Franklin with his nose in whatever book Pearl had handed him most recently and little Margaret more interested in the pictures of the horses in the almanac. And it was a quiet life and a full one, and it was theirs. On a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1885, exactly 7 years after the bank letter had arrived on a Tuesday, Pearl and Wesley sat on their porch in the late light with their coffee, and the panhandle spread out before them in the particular autumn gold she had always loved, and Wesley said, out of a comfortable silence, that he wanted her to know something. She said what? He said that the morning he had ridden out in the fog and found her moving cattle in the half-dark, and he had made the decision to help without asking anything in return. He had not been entirely selfless. She said she knew that. He said she did. She said she had always known he was in love with her, which was why she had trusted the help, because it came from feeling rather than calculation, and feeling did not require repayment the same way. He said that was a very perceptive thing. She said she was a very perceptive person. He said he knew that too. The evening light was long and golden on the dry grass, and the cattle were visible in the far pasture, dark shapes moving slowly in the dusk. And Franklin's voice came from inside the house, where he was reading at the kitchen table, and Margaret was probably finding something she was not supposed to find, because that was what Margaret did. And Pearl leaned against Wesley's shoulder on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet of everything they had built. She thought about the 7 letters with their 7 offers, each one calculating, each one seeing the land and not the person living on it. She thought about what it had felt like to read them, the cold clarity of being valued as a transaction. She thought about a morning in the fog, the sound of hoofbeats, a man coming around the far side of scattered cattle without being asked. She thought about a roll of wire in a saddlebag, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal left without comment, a book on a porch with no note because the choosing of it was the message, $400 given without leverage. A presence beside her on a porch at 3 in the morning when the rain was loud and the cattle were loose and everything felt precarious. She had been saved by none of those things individually and all of them collectively, and the man who had provided them was sitting beside her on the porch of the home they shared, and his arm was around her, and she could feel his warmth against the cooling evening air. She said she had something to tell him. He said what was that? She said she thought there was going to be another one. He was still for a moment, and then he turned to look at her, and his face in the autumn light was so open and so honest that she felt it in her chest the same way she had felt it on every significant occasion, like the first time, every time. He said, was she certain? She said she was generally certain about most things, and this was not an exception. He said, very quietly, that he was very glad. She said so was she. He kissed her temple and she leaned into him, and they sat together on the porch of the Ellsworth Atkins ranch in the gathering dark of an autumn evening in Texas, 7 years after a bank letter and a roll of wire and a man who had simply stayed and helped, and it was everything. The 3rd child was another boy, born in the early summer of 1886, and they named him Wesley Jr., which the elder Wesley objected to as being too vain. And Pearl told him it was not vanity. It was inheritance, the same way Franklin had been named for her father and Margaret for her mother, and she wanted their children to carry the names of people worth carrying. He relented, as he always eventually relented when Pearl put something in those terms, not because he was weak, but because she was almost always right. Wesley Jr. grew up between his brother Franklin's seriousness and his sister Margaret's bold improvisation, and turned out to have his father's quiet steadiness and his mother's dry humor, which was, everyone agreed, a fortunate combination. The Ellsworth Atkins ranch continued. The cattle operation expanded carefully and not recklessly, the way Wesley managed all things, sustainably, building the herd's quality rather than simply its size, using the Shorthorn bloodlines Pearl had invested in at the beginning to maintain the premium prices that had saved them once and continued to serve them well. By the late 1880s, theirs was among the more respected operations in Haskell County, not the largest, not the flashiest, but the most consistent, the most reliably managed, the kind of place that buyers came back to year after year because what they got was always exactly what they had been told to expect. Calhoun Monroe's operation ran into difficulty in 1887 when a combination of overextension and a bad winter thinned his herd severely, and he sold portions of his range to a developer from Fort Worth. And Pearl heard about it without satisfaction, but also without grief, because that was the nature of the territory. Things came and went, and the people who stayed were the ones who had built their foundations out of honest work rather than the leveraging of other people's misfortune. The county began to change in those years, as the great open range gave way to more formal settlement, more fencing, more legal structure, the long Comanche trails becoming roads, the trails becoming routes, the loose frontier beginning to settle into something more like the society further east. Pearl and Wesley watched this transformation with the complex feeling of people who had come of age in one kind of world, and were watching it become another, not entirely mourning the wildness, because the wildness had been hard in ways that were easy to romanticize only at a distance, but aware that something was passing that would not return. The railroad came closer in 1888, making the cattle drives shorter and the prices more stable, which was good for business and also meant that the old ways of moving cattle across the open country were fading. And Pearl thought of all the miles she had ridden checking her herd, and all the pre-dawn mornings, and all the fence repairs, and felt, looking at the coming railroad, something that was pride more than nostalgia, because all of those hard things had made something that lasted. Franklin grew tall and serious and good with numbers, and by 1890, he was helping Pearl manage the accounts with a competence that made her think he would be better than either of his parents at the business side of ranching, which she told him, and which he absorbed with the calm confidence of someone who already knew his own worth, a thing she and Wesley had apparently managed to give him without trying too hard. Margaret was fearless and definite in all things, and argued with her brother about everything, and would not be managed by anyone, which Pearl found both exhausting and secretly gratifying as she watched her daughter hold her own in every conversation with twice her age and confidence. And she thought sometimes of herself at that age, and hoped that Margaret would have an easier time of it than she had. Wesley taught all three children to ride properly and to handle cattle and to fix a fence, because those were fundamental things, and he held the view that fundamental things should be taught without regard to what was expected of whom. He also taught all three of them to read carefully and to think about what they read, which Pearl supported fully, and which led to a household that was considerably louder at the dinner table than most in Haskell County, because everyone had opinions and was not shy about them. In the spring of 1892, Pearl and Wesley stood at the gate between the original two properties, the gate that had become something of a private landmark for them, the place where things had shifted, and they looked across the combined land that was now so thoroughly woven into one operation that the original boundary was almost invisible to anyone who had not known it when it was a real division. Wesley said he had been thinking about the gate. She said, "What about it?" He said they should probably take it out since there was no longer any fence on either side of it that served any purpose. It was just standing there. Pearl said she thought they should leave it. He looked at her. She said some things should stay standing even when they no longer need to because they mark where something important happened. He was quiet for a moment and then he said he supposed that was right. She said she thought it was. He took her hand and they stood at the gate in the warm spring morning, and behind them the house was alive with the sound of their children and the distant morning activity of the ranch. And before them the land stretched long and wide in theirs, fully and permanently, the thing she had fought to keep, and the life she had not known she was also building, all at once, all together, in the same season of her life that had seemed for a while like it might only hold loss. She thought about all the offers she had refused. The low prices and the calculated propositions, and the man who had suggested she trade her own home for a lined shack, and the man who had suggested she trade herself for capital. She thought about what it had taken to refuse all of them, the stubbornness, and the pride, and the deep knowledge that she was worth more than what was being offered, that the land was worth more, and the life on it was worth more. And she thought about the thing that had come instead, not as an offer but as a presence, not as a price but as a person, not as a transaction but as a Tuesday morning, and a roll of wire and a man who had asked nothing and given everything, and waited 6 years to say a word because he had not wanted to be another thing she had to manage. She tightened her hand around his. He tightened his hand around hers. The gate stood between them and the sky, battered and a little crooked from years of weather, but standing, the way things that mark important places tend to stand, holding the memory of a border that had once been real and was now so thoroughly dissolved that you had to know the story to understand what the gate was doing there at all. Pearl Ellsworth, who was Pearl Ellsworth Atkins now, but who had never stopped being Pearl Ellsworth first, looked at the land that was hers and the man beside her who was also hers and who she was also his, and she felt the deep, settled, unglamorous happiness of a life that had been built carefully from real things, and she was, entirely and without reservation, glad. That evening at supper, the family sat around the large table that Wesley had built when they combined the households, because neither of their original tables was quite large enough for all of them. And Franklin told a story from the day's work that made his brother laugh and his sister dispute the details loudly, and Pearl and Wesley looked at each other across the table over the noise of their family, the way that two people look at each other when they have been paying attention to the same life from the same direction for a long time, and they both see the same thing and know it. Later, when the children were settled and the house was quiet, Pearl sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the accounts open in front of her, doing the pleasurable arithmetic of a solvent and growing operation, and Wesley came and set a cup of coffee at her elbow, black with a small amount of sugar, exactly as she liked it, exactly as she had mentioned once years ago, and he had never forgotten. She looked up at him. He said he was going to read for a while if she was going to be working. She said she would not be long. He said she could take as long as she needed. She said she knew. He sat in his chair by the window with his book, and the lamplight made the room warm and small and complete, and Pearl looked at her accounts and her husband and the window and the Texas night beyond it, and she thought that this was the shape of a life that had gone right, not without difficulty, and not without fear, and not without the kinds of losses that leave permanent marks, but right in the ways that matter. Honest and earned and held by people who had chosen each other freely and completely, and without any calculation except the clearest one, that there was no one else in the world they would rather be doing all of this with. She finished her accounts. She closed the ledger. She blew out the lamp. Wesley looked up from his book. She held out her hand to him. He closed his book and took it. They went together into the warm, dark house, and the night was wide and quiet outside, and the cattle were settled in the pastures, and the gate stood between the two pieces of land that had long since become one, and the Ellsworth Atkins ranch held everything that had been saved and everything that had been built, all of it permanent and true, all of it earned in the particular way that only honesty and time and staying can earn anything, all of it theirs.